Satanic Panic. Sounds fun, doesn't it? I mean, it rhymes, it involves Satan. But for many people, this phenomenon caused real, lasting damage. For a time in the 80s and into the 90s, stories of satanic ritual abuse were everywhere. Heavy metal music was turning kids toward devil worship. Intergenerational cults were abusing, maiming, and murdering children, and Geraldo Rivera's talk show was there to tell you all about it. People were arrested, charged, prosecuted, and even convicted for these terrible deeds. The thing is, none of it was true. It never happened. I'm Eric Bowman, the communications specialist at the Canadian Psychological Association, and this is Mindful. One of the things that makes the Satanic Panic so fascinating for me, and for psychologists, is that while psychologists and mental health professionals are uniquely positioned to explain the causes and long-lasting effects of this mass delusion, some of them also unwittingly contributed to causing it in the first place. Our guest today thinks that learning about this unfortunate episode in our collective history is more important than we might realize.
I'm Randy Paterson, a psychologist in Vancouver, Canada, with a clinical practice here, and author of the Assertiveness Workbook and How to Be Miserable, 40 Strategies You Already Use.
Fantastic. And I asked you to be on the podcast because we just came from our CPA convention in St. John's, and one of the first talks at that convention was your talk on the Satanic Panic. And I tried to get in to see the talk, but I couldn't because it was standing room only and people were spilled out into the hallway. We did not give you a big enough room for this talk, it seems. So I want to give you a slightly larger platform to bring the story to more people. Can we start with just having you explain a little bit about what the Satanic Panic was for those of us who are not quite old enough to have lived through the days of the Phil Donahue and Oprah Winfrey shows?
Well, this is something that really came up in the late 1980s, starting really in 1980, and then proceeded through until the early 1990s, and mostly faded out after that. It was a belief that there are multi-generational satanic worshiping cults embedded in almost every city and town in North America, and that the practice of these cults is to kidnap children and get adults involved and perform rituals to the devil and sacrifice children. People are tortured, people are ritually sexually abused, and people are forced to drink blood and so on. And their memories of these things are suppressed and prevented from arising into consciousness. But later in life, the idea is they often begin showing signs of psychological distress of some kind. They might get stressed out in their workplace. They might have sleep difficulties and so on. And these are sure signs that this has happened. And so this was a widespread belief amongst mental health workers of various types, amongst child protection workers, and in the legal sphere and law enforcement sphere as well at that time. Obviously, not everybody believed in this, but a fair substantial number did. Quite a phenomenon.
And what strikes me as absolutely staggering is that, one, there was no evidence that any of this was ever taking place, right? This really was something that could have been investigated and dismissed early on, but it ended up making it to a national stage, especially in the United States. You know, Oprah Winfrey had this on her show, right? Phil Donahue had it on his show. Ricky Lake had it on her show, and people were talking about this as though it was a real thing that was actually happening. And the mainstreaming of it seems to have happened very quickly. Am I wrong in that? Did it take longer than overnight, or was it very, very fast?
It seemed to be fairly fast, but it was done against a backdrop, within the mental health field for many decades. Sexual abuse of children was really not thought of as something that happened very often. It wasn't really a focus of concern. And around the 1970s and 1980s, I mean, the sheer volume of evidence finally broke through into mental health consciousness to realize that, yes, actually, this does happen. There are quite a number of cases of kids being molested, often by their own family members or friends of the family or within theological settings. And this is not an uncommon thing. And so there was this impulse to say, look, let's actually start believing people when they say this. And this was probably almost entirely a good idea.
Right.
But out of this comes a practice of recovered memory therapy. The idea that people have been through these tremendous traumatic events and then have managed to forget all about them and to like not just not think about them, which is something that many of us do about some of the things that have happened to us, but actually lose the memory, lose the file card, if you like, so that we can't find the memory of these things happening. And so in a lot of therapy practices, the idea was that through hypnosis and through having people imagine these things might have happened, they develop memories, and you can actually create memories of being molested by almost anybody, your father, your mother, Cleopatra, almost anybody. And so people began to develop these powerful convictions that these things had happened. Now, there's some question as when people are traumatized, do they actually forget things? And of course, before a certain age, people forget most of their childhood, their infancy, and so on. So there is some possibility that people do forget some of these things that happen. However, out of that came a lot of therapy in which people were, quote, learning, unquote, that these things had happened in their past, which in many instances probably had not. There was a psychologist at the time, Elizabeth Loftus, who was doing some work demonstrating that it is very, very possible to implant memories if you're not careful.
Right.
So out of that fertile ground, suddenly comes this idea of Satanism being an issue. And this was around the time that the wife of the vice president of the United States, Tipper Gore, was getting very concerned about satanic lyrics and heavy metal music. And you might
Yes.
remember that there was all this stuff about backward masking in the lyrics. So if you played the lyric backward, it would say you love Satan," or things like
Yes. I don't, I won't say I remember that. It was a little before my time, but I did go down a pretty fun rabbit hole of watching Frank Zappa and John Denver testify in front of Congress about lyrics and music and how, this was all a great mistake to be focusing on this, and you're looking at the wrong things. Dee Snider, I think, from Twisted Sister, was testifying as well. All of them very eloquent, all of them very persuasive, and none of them really made a dent, it seems.
And this was around the time as well of the subliminal seduction in advertising. You know, if you sketch little naked figures into the ice cubes in your cola, people will buy lots more. That turned out probably not to be the case, but people were certainly very enthusiastic about it. But where does all of this really crystallize and get triggered? A lot of Canadians have been looking at this and looking perhaps south of the border and thinking, gosh, where did all this QAnon stuff come from? I mean, all this incredible nonsense that suddenly cropped up. How could people believe such silly things? And where does it come from? And the answer is look in the mirror, because that's where it comes from. It comes from us. Specifically, it comes in large part from Canada, and in large part from Victoria, British Columbia, not renowned as at the time as the site of very exciting things like satanic rituals, but a book that was published by Lawrence Pastor and Michelle Smith in 1980 called Michelle Remembers. Michelle Smith was a woman who experienced postpartum depression. And she was, or actually not postpartum, I apologize, miscarriage-related depression. And she was seen by Pastor, a psychiatrist, for 3 years. And at the end of that 3 years, she began speaking in the voice of a child. And Pastor apparently began thinking, my gosh, what's going on here? And he claimed that in the next 14 months, he carried out 600 hours of hypnosis. Now, if you do the math, that's over an hour and a half every day, including Christmas.
Right.
Uh, so maybe, could be. That's a pretty dedicated sequence of events there. But anyway, and in the course of this, Smith began reporting memories of things that had happened to her in 1954, 1955, which was a long pattern of satanic ritual abuse by her mother's ancient satanic cult, multi-generational satanic cult, in which she was tortured, she was sexually assaulted, she viewed human sacrifices, she was daubed with the blood of victims, and she reported that she was in an 81-day long ceremony in the Ross Bay Cemetery involving hundreds of participants, many of whom had their index fingers amputated in the course of the ceremony. At the end of 81 days, apparently Jesus Christ, Mary, his mother, and the Archangel Michael eventually intervened. I imagine they'd been busy elsewhere for those
Right.
81 days. But eventually they show up, a bit late, you might think, but anyway, to remove the scars that she had received in the course of these ceremonies and to bury the memories. These theological figures are tremendously powerful, but not quite as powerful as Lawrence Pastor, MD.
And not quite as prompt as one would hope them to be. You would think they would come before the abuse began rather than afterward, but yeah.
It's a big world. They must have been busy.
Yeah.
There's other things going on. So a pastor, though, can undo the spell, if you like, and unbury all of these memories, and they're published in this book. And that seems to have triggered much of this hysteria.
Now, I'm curious, you mentioned earlier, right? A lot of us when we're young kids, we don't remember much. I mean, I don't remember much of my childhood before I was 10 years old or however old, right? And you use the word forgot, right? We can forget things that happened to us at that age. Is there a difference between forgetting what happened and actually repressing a memory? And is repressing a memory such that you completely memory hole it and you don't remember it happening at all? Is that a scientifically valid concept? Is that we hear about it a lot? Is that something that people do?
It's a matter of considerable debate as to whether this actually happens. Certainly, you can get things where a child has absolutely no memory of something. In my own childhood, as a matter of fact, apparently, I was about 4 and had something happen and was actually taken to a hospital and was examined and was very upset at the time and so on. And I have absolutely no memory of this. This was during a trip to Montreal. One would think that being in a new setting, that would be quite memorable. Zero memory of it.
Right.
So, but I probably have very few memories of other things around the time I was 4 as well. I think I could probably write them down in a paragraph, anything that I remember from that age.
Yes.
So, indeed, we do completely just not preserve memory traces from early childhood. That's quite common. But the idea behind this, partly promoted by the psychoanalysts of the early 20th century, is that if an event is beyond your ability to emotionally handle, then your brain will protect you by just taking it out of consciousness altogether, and in effect, virtually permanently until a qualified mental health professional can uncover it again. But the sign that's usually used to uncover it are pretty vague psychological symptoms that, in fact, most of us have experienced. Random periods of lassitude, anxieties about things that we probably shouldn't be anxious about, burnout at work, this kind of thing. Certainly, anybody with sexual difficulties can have this kind of thing diagnosed relatively readily. People can imagine that, there's a reason why you have these problems during sexual activity. And the evidence in favor of this is a little bit scant. There are allegedly cases where people have gone back and discovered, oh, yeah, actually, you know what? That did happen. We did find the police record,
Right.
that kind of thing. Does it happen commonly? It doesn't appear to. The nature of post-traumatic stress disorder generally is that it's a problem of too much memory, not too little. People can't forget that this horrible thing happened and it's intruding on their everyday experience constantly,
Right.
not that it's been erased altogether. So it's almost the opposite of the way that we normally think of traumatic experience.
Now, most of my familiarity with this whole satanic panic thing is the case in Martinsville, in Saskatchewan, where they interviewed a whole pile of children, right? There was one accusation that led to another to another. The whole thing snowballed. And it wasn't that they were recovering repressed memories from adults. They were interviewing children, and it wasn't, it seems, necessarily qualified mental health professionals who were doing this. It was police who were doing this. They were basically making suggestions to the kids. The kids would then, realize, like, the more brutal and crazy my story is, the more rewarded I get from the police who are asking this. They're conditioned to believe the kids at all costs, but they're also planting ideas in the kids' brains. And in the end, more than a dozen people, I think, were actually charged with a satanic ritual cult. They'd even given it a name, something, the Ram, something or whatever, and none of it had ever happened. And that, to me, I think of it differently than trying to recover the memory of an adult who's having difficulties when you're speaking with children who are, I presume, eminently more susceptible to suggestion in that circumstance.
Yeah. Yeah. In the Martinsville case, there were 9 accused. And in actual fact, the involvement of the police kind of backfired a little bit because 5 of the accused were police officers. There were over 100 charges laid. There were convictions obtained, actually, unusually for these kinds of things. They actually got some convictions in this case, but those convictions were later overturned. In some cases, children were actually removed from their families, reputations were destroyed, and so on. There is a CBC related podcast.
Yes, the season 6 of Uncover,
That's
which
right.
which is a fascinating podcast.
And it really goes over that whole thing. Yeah, the Martinsville event is sort of one of the more prominent ones in Canada. There are some others. But internationally, or at least in the States, the most famous one is the McMartin trial, based on another daycare. Daycares were a risky business in the 1980s, 1990s, I'll tell you. But the McMartin preschool was in Manhattan Beach, California, and it was just south of Los Angeles. And a mother noticed something with her son, and the result was an accusation made. Actually, the preschool worker was accused in that case. Other staff were subsequently accused, and the police decided that the best way to do this is to send a letter to the parents and get the parents to interview all of their children about whether this had happened. It's a really controlled environment. The result was 360 children identified as likely victims. And initially, the first little bits of this had nothing to do with satanic ritual abuse, but the children began reporting with exactly the same amount of conviction, other things happening, like witches flying around. The abuse was taking place in hidden tunnels underneath the preschool, that children are being flushed down toilets into underground facilities where all of this was going on. And the original accusing mother eventually claimed that the preschool worker who had first been accused could fly. And we're not talking Pan Am here.
Right.
And eventually there were 321 charges against 7 staff. There were 2 trials. They took 7 years in total. There were 0 convictions, but it was the most expensive trial in American history, not just in
Wow.
this area, but in any area.
Wow.
So these kinds of things were happening quite a lot. And they cropped up all over the place. There were also cases in the Netherlands and in the UK. And less dramatically, it was cropping up in individual psychotherapy as well. As clinicians became convinced that this was a real thing, they began asking their clients about it, who began spontaneously recovering, that should be considered in quotes, recovering memories of these outlandish events, including
Right.
all kinds of paranormal phenomena.
Yeah. And it strikes me, you know, like I guess my main question in all of this is, how do people become so convinced that this is happening? Right? You mentioned QAnon, and it strikes me that there are a lot of similarities there. There are tunnels under this preschool, just like there are supposed to be tunnels under this pizza place in Washington D.C. where they're trafficking children. And you can easily determine that there are no tunnels there. You can just go there and look, and there are no tunnels. And shouldn't that sort of end the thing right there? But it doesn't seem to, and it becomes such a persistent belief. Even Martinsville, I was just reading an article from one of the police officers who was accused, who didn't live there, who had stopped in for a coffee on his way to another place and ended up being part of this accused group and was convicted and, had that overturned. And he says that there are still people in his own police department who don't believe that he wasn't involved in this. People still to this day think that he was a part of, this thing that so clearly never happened. I'm just wondering how that can become such a fixed belief in people all around, the people who are there, the ones who should be able to see the evidence and make a determination that, no, this didn't happen.
Well, I mean, part of it is the idea of secret knowledge, which is really part of how conspiracy theories generally go out and get sort of reinforced, whether it's flat Earth, whether it's alien abductions, whether it's almost anything. The idea is that by knowing about this stuff, by quote, educating, unquote, yourself about them, you develop special knowledge that really sets you apart from the rest of humanity, who are the sheep who just believe the standard story about existence. You understand the real thing, and you know that there's this vast conspiracy to convince you that there are no aliens, there are no witches, there are no Satanist cults. The world is a globe. They're trying to convince you of this stuff. And as a matter of fact, some of those people are just ignorant and others are part of the conspiracy. And so there was a bit of a fear around the time, and I remember this in the 1980s and early 90s, that if you were a clinician and said, I don't think any of this is actually happening, there was a possibility that people would say, well, maybe you're a part of it. And that's
Right.
why you're saying this. Also, once you have believed something that's this outlandish, what are your choices? Your choices are one, believe that as weird as this seems, you have finally got the truth, and we want the truth, and we want to be able to help people. Or you believe that in fact, you have been fooled in believing something that has absolutely no evidence, that is completely false, and you have damaged people's lives in the process. One of those options is preferable to the other
Right.
for the maintenance of your own self-esteem, and if you're a professional who's been involved in this, to your own professional identity.
Hmm.
Imagine going into this for, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and realizing that you just spent 15 years of your life destroying families for no good reason, based on nonsense and your own gullibility.
Right.
That would be a hard thing to face.
I remember in that podcast you were talking about, the CBC one about Martinsville, that there was a psychologist who would go to all of the trials, all of the trial days in Saskatoon, because all the trials had to happen in Saskatoon because Martinsville is such a small town. And she would say, I can't remember her name off the top of my head now, but she would say at these trials and basically yell at anyone who would listen, if you killed so many children, why are there no missing children, right? If you amputated the limbs of children, why are there no children with limbs missing, right? Like, you know, and no one seemed to listen to her. No one paid attention. You know, she, you know, got written up sort of as a crank in the local newspaper and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, you would get quite trashed. A lot of the people around when Elizabeth Loftus was pointing out that it's actually trivially easy to implant false memories. A lot of people were being very critical of any clinician promoting that point of view, or at least even mentioning that research, because maybe those clinicians are abusers themselves. And in the case of the amputated limbs, yes, I mean all of the stuff about the original Michelle Remembers case in Victoria, there was a prominent place played by a motor vehicle accident, a severe motor vehicle accident. There was no record of that. The ceremony was supposedly taking place in the Ross Bay Cemetery. There was no record of that. And the Ross Bay Cemetery is not exactly downtown Victoria, but it's not that far away. It would be hard to disguise such a thing. And hospitals were not reporting sudden epidemics of missing index fingers.
Right.
I think one of the most interesting things about this whole episode is the directionality of it. Often these, what we might think of as mass delusions, take place amongst the public, and then professionals view it as their job to wade in there and go, okay, come on now, that's not actually true. We've investigated it, calm down, and so on, or whatever. That never seems to work, by the way.
Right.
But this was an instance in which the spread, the virus of the belief, seemed to spread most readily amongst the professional groups involved. So amongst police, amongst the legal system, possibly a little less amongst the legal system, given the so few convictions, but amongst the mental health workers and child protection and so on. And to the point that it was often the professionals almost indoctrinating the public in this belief rather than the other way around. So this was a
Right.
mass delusion, but not really a mass delusion in the public. It was a mass delusion in the professions.
And it was the professionals that lent it credibility when they went on the talk shows and the daytime shows and the news shows at night and that sort of thing, right?
That's true. I mean, there were members of the public obviously involved as well, but this was a to a great extent a mental health driven delusion.
Yeah, and that's something that fascinates me too, is that mental health professionals are the ones who can sort of explain why it happened, but also we're in a large part the cause of it in the first place, because it's not like mental health professionals aren't as susceptible as the rest of us to this sort of, way of thinking, I guess.
And that's the rationale for my deciding to do that talk at CPA. I mean, supposedly it was a talk about, this bizarre thing that happened 35 years ago, but actually it was a stealth critique of the field. My agenda actually there in part was to go through all of this and then point out that we were supposed to be immune to this. The Boulder model. I did a quick dog leg, and people were in the room going, "Why are we talking about the Boulder model?" The Boulder model of training of clinical psychologists was proposed by David Shakow in 1949 at a conference in Boulder, Colorado. And the idea was, at the time, there were sort of two branches of psychology. There was the experimentalists who were, running rats through mazes and doing paired associate learning, that kind of thing. And then there were the practitioners, many of whom had been involved in World War II in recruitment, selection, and assigning people to tasks that they might actually turn out to be good at. And so these two fields, almost with this chasm between them, how do we ensure that this developing profession of clinical psychology becomes basically reputable? And the idea was the scientist practitioner model. Let's train these people not just with clinical technique, but also in research skills. So that what will happen is that once they're out there in the public practicing, they will they will understand research, they will value research, they will be able to evaluate research, and in effect, this training that they've received will be a kind of vaccination against nonsense.
Right.
And so my point with much of this talk was the vaccination didn't seem to take because we, well, many in the field fell prey to nonsense that was absolutely unsupported. I mean, completely unusual nonsense. And it should have prevented that, and it didn't.
Hmm.
And we don't seem to have gone back and examined very closely how did that happen?
Right.
Because it happened once. Could it happen again?
And I'm wondering though, I because this is a very specific thing, right? You mentioned some other things, and I'm sure that there are mental health professionals who believe that the world is flat, or who believe they're in alien abductions, or that we never landed on the moon or something, right? Which are by and large harmless beliefs in terms of conspiracy theories, right? They're not really doing anyone any harm. You might believe this, but okay. Something like, the Satanic Panic, something like QAnon, those are things that do specific damage and specific harm. And I'm wondering if the reason for that is that both are predicated on this notion of protecting children from abuse, right? And I often think about the QAnon phenomenon as, the people who are really out there and they really want to defend children and they really want to do everything in their power to make sure that children don't get harmed. And that's a great motivation to have. But in the end, it turns out that they do more harm because it deflects from the actual harms children are experiencing, actual abuse, by focusing on this fictional narrative that, spreads more quickly, it seems, because of the nature of the idea of children being abused and how we have to stop that, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of my concerns, even lo these many years later, in doing this talk, was that people are going to think I'm standing up there and saying sexual abuse of children is nonsense, doesn't happen, it's ridiculous, and we need to stop believing in it. Not at all. And I pointed out, wouldn't it be remarkable? This conference was taking place in St. John's, Newfoundland. And I said, wouldn't it be remarkable for me to make that point standing as I am 5 kilometers from Mount Cashel,
Right.
the orphanage in which, yes, the theological organization was sexually abusing many children, and stories like that emerged all across the country and internationally over time. That indeed the sexual abuse of children was extremely common. Canada has gone through the residential schools disaster. This is a very common phenomenon. It just turned out it wasn't Satanists doing it.
Right.
you know, so to some extent, this side focus may have detracted some focus on what was actually going on. Is it possible that within the field of clinical psychology, there are other things that might be harmful? Could we fall prey to other things, maybe a little bit less dramatic or outlandish than satanic ritual abuse, but could we fall prey to ideas out of, as you point out, the goodness of our hearts, believing in the benevolence of our intentions? Could we fall prey to things that inadvertently cause damage again? And I would argue that we've had 35 years or so since the satanic ritual abuse stuff, and if that door has been left open, then some little cockroach should have walked in over that 35 years. And I think the answer to that is it has. It was only a few years later that a kind of, I'm tempted to say, mania for critical incident stress debriefing swept the mental health field with the absolutely benevolent and appropriate intention of preventing the proliferation of PTSD. So that when people have been through a traumatic event, let's do something right away to prevent this from progressing to a debilitating psychological problem. People loved that so much that the procedures recommended were adopted pretty much nationwide and internationally. And it turned out once the science had been done, one would think it would have been done earlier, but it wasn't, that either it was completely ineffective or it actually increased the rate of PTSD. It was more harm than good. So these things come back in possibly less sexy formats, but but if we have left a door of nonsense open in the field, we need to pay attention to it. And I think we need to teach students in clinical programs about the mistakes, not just about the grand successes, not just about the great techniques, but about the ways that we have failed in the past, the kinds of things that the field has fallen prey to.
You're talking about these things that we later discover aren't true, that, have been sort of taken as gospel or have really been grasped onto by people who want to do something good. And then they become institutionalized, right? That the institution of the police or the institution of the mental health field or the institution of the courts believes it so strongly that changing that mind is going to be a lot more difficult than it otherwise might have been. Is that the same thing? Is that the same basic process as a person who starts to believe these things and then has a difficulty being dissuaded, or is it different on an institutional level?
I think there are strong similarities. If you're a client, for example, of a clinician who has inadvertently convinced you that this has happened in your own family, and you have blown your family apart in the process, you have cut off all contact with your parents, you've accused one of your parents of sexually abusing you or of indoctrinating you into a cult or something like that, there's a fair berm against you acknowledging that maybe that was never true, right? So it's such a threatening idea. You've created a real reluctance to acknowledge that. Through all of this, my point has been that not that children weren't abused, the children were abused. All of those children in all of those cases were abused, but they were abused by the legal system, by the police, by the mental health care system, by child protection. They were abused inadvertently.
You were talking about, we need to teach the failures as well as the successes. And part of the phenomenon of something like the Satanic Panic or things that you see going on today is the lasting power that they have, right? That they become part of the zeitgeist, they become part of pop culture, they become part of general knowledge. And it's so hard to put the genie back in the bottle. And I'm thinking of discredited experiments in the past, the Stanford prison experiment, right? The Milgram's obedience experiments, things like that, that have become just part of pop culture. They're mentioned in the media. They're mentioned in, TV shows and movies as factual experiments that yielded a proper result, even though the methodology's been discredited, the ethics of them have been discredited over the years. And so I'm thinking that maybe that is a place to start, right? Some of these things that we all are aware of, but that probably don't mean what we think they mean,
Yeah, I mean there are certainly things that when you're building a field, you create a foundation, and then people come along and they do subsequent research that build on top of that foundation. And sometimes you need to go back and sort of dig under the building and realize, oh gosh, parts of the foundation are a little rotten. We may have made some assumptions that were not actually true. In the case of some of the studies that you've mentioned, the difficulty may be more ethical than anything else, in that they might be a study that we would never be permitted to do today, but there might have been some valuable things that came out of them. It's hard to know. But indeed, yeah, these things sort of seep in. And there are not that many clinicians these days that you would think would say, "Oh, yes, satanic ritual abuse is a real thing." There is at least one that I'm aware of who says such a thing, but not many. But you wonder whether it's seeped into the culture or seeped into the field in some way. The QAnon is basically a resurrection of pretty close to exactly the same thing, for example, And also in my work clinically, a lot of the work that I do is on failure to launch, so-called emerging adulthood, people having difficulty seizing their adult independence. And when we look at where does this come from, the short answer is we don't know. But the longer answer seems to be some degree of overprotection seems to be taking place in a lot of cases. We see a lot of young adults who've never been on transit because they've never been allowed to, because as a child they might get kidnapped or who knows what might happen. And I've wondered whether one of the long-standing influences of the satanic ritual abuse thing has been that children today can't walk to school, can't take transit in many places, are constantly on play dates only with people that your parents have approved of. And I wonder if that's an ongoing sort of destructive outcome of this delusion.
That could be. The idea that, yes, some stranger is going to come by and kidnap your kid and that sort of thing. I've never associated that with the Satanic Panic or any of that. I suppose I've always thought that that was, because those cases, when they do happen, get a heck of a lot of media attention, and the Amber Alerts go out and all this kind of thing. Now 90% of Amber Alerts, I think, are parental or family related in some way, right? But
Yeah, I mean these events are actually not that common. They don't seem to be becoming more common either. I think the perception in the public is that, you let your kid out of your sight for 2 minutes and they're going to be gone. I don't think that is any more true today than it was in the 1950s. I could be wrong there. Criminology is not my thing. But I think that this, in part, created an atmosphere of danger for kids and for upbringing that may have contributed to some of the caution that results in people today not being as trained in independence. That's coming from somebody who spent part of his childhood playing in storm drains underneath the local golf course. So, maybe in some ways it's better. I don't know.
yeah, you mentioned though that like QAnon is basically a reflection of the Satanic Panic. It is a cycle that's coming back around, and I'm thinking that there's a lot of things that are sort of cyclical in the same way, right? Geo Ferguson's work at the turn of the 20th century on race and IQ, which really confused correlation and causation, which has been debunked over and over, but gets cited again and gets brought back when somebody else does a study on race and IQ. And right up into the 2000s, people were doing these studies that were really a reflection of that one, which all along the way had used flawed methodology, had come up with an outcome that they wanted to see, and then worked backwards in order to achieve that outcome through a study, right?
Yeah, I mean, we develop our methods and we develop our rigor. And as time passes, hopefully what we like to do is move forward in the field and sort of build on what has come before, stand on the shoulders of giants, if you like. What we don't realize is that sometimes we're standing on the shoulders of sand, and that the original studies are really not that great. And probably we need to go back and re-examine again those foundations.
And you mentioned the Boulder method, which is this idea of teaching psychologists and researchers at the same time. The psychologists need to be, and you said that hasn't fully, it must have inoculated at least some people in some way, right? It must have done some good on some level, I would imagine. Or is there a way to do it better?
Well, I think absolutely it's been helpful. For example, if people are on a multidisciplinary team, chances are the psychologist on the team knows more about research design, knows more about experimental rigor, knows more about statistics than the physicians, the nurses, the OTs, the social workers, or anybody else on the team. So I think it's really served us well in a lot of areas. And I don't mean to say that the Boulder model should just be like tossed aside, but clearly as a vaccine against nonsense, it wasn't sufficient. And we
Hmm.
need to do something more. When in my training, actually in my undergraduate years, we had to take history of psychology. And a lot of us thought, really, do we have to do this? Do we have, do we have to hear all about all this, these old guys? Old white guys, which invariably they were. But I think there's actually some tremendous value to that. We need to know that repeatedly in our field, we have developed great enthusiasms out of the goodness of our heart, out of our great intentions, and have stepped in the muck as a result, and either have produced no beneficial effects or have actually harmed people. And so I think the training of that, and that was the tail end of my St. John's talk, was to really exhort people, some of the training people that were there, and I knew that there were some training faculty of training programs there, to teach people the mistakes. Don't teach people about the grandeur of our fields and how wonderful we are and how look at this success we've made and look at that success we've made. Let's look at where things have gone wrong, at least as well, maybe
Yes.
not even as much, but at least let's do it some so that when people come along and they don't feel like they can rely on everything that's being said in the field, that they retain that skeptical, empirical perspective.
And that the field progresses and learns more, and as everybody learns more, everybody improves, what it is they're doing. I was just reading that in the 1910s and 20s, at the beginning of the Tour de France, physicians recommended to cyclists that on the mountain stages, which are especially strenuous, that they smoke cigarettes while going up the mountain because that was going to open up your lungs and make things, easier for you as you went up the mountain. Advice that today would sound crazy, but they believed it at one time, and then they learned more over the years, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. The converse is also true that sometimes the older knowledge that we have is as valuable and as important to be taught as the sort of cutting edge insights. I'm thinking particularly of the research on process in psychotherapy, indicating that some of those very, very basic process oriented Rogerian maxims seem to be as important or more important in client outcome than the specifics of technique. Most of the benefit of psychotherapy seems to have to do with the quality of the relationship and process issues as opposed to the individual strategies that the clinician is using. And that's coming from me. I spent most of my career training people in specific cognitive behavioral strategies, but the reality is the relationship is almost certainly more important. So, we can go back and we can look at some of the foundational things and reinforce them, not just tear them apart.
For sure. And all right, we'll close with this then. What's your favorite heavy metal band?
Oh gosh. Um, I can't think of a good heavy metal band. There was a Finnish heavy metal band that competed in the Eurovision Song Contest, and at one point that I quite liked, and the name of which is currently escaping me. Oh, Lordi. That was interesting, but I think a lot of people are probably not going to be Lordi fans, and I think a lot of heavy metal fans would sneer at that.
Perhaps. I've been trying to get a heavy metal band on this podcast for the last 2 years because we did an episode on vulvodynia, a medical condition that affects women specifically. And there's a South African heavy metal band that named themselves that after looking it up in a medical journal and deciding that that was the perfect name for a heavy metal band. And I'm fascinated as to how they made that decision.
Well, you'll have to ask them if they put satanic lyrics backwards in their song and see what they say.
Are you a proper heavy metal band if you don't?
I think most of them, in fact, didn't. I mean, it's pretty much a waste of time. I think they have better things to do.
I expect so. I don't think too many people are experimenting with that backward looping that, I think the Beatles did it briefly in the 60s, and then that became, I think people think it happens more often than it does because of the Beatles. Once again, something that gets in the zeitgeist and doesn't go away, right?
Could be, yeah, absolutely.
An unwillingness to continue learning is part of what led to the Satanic Panic in the 80s and 90s, and a desire to understand, to probe, and to get at the truth is what makes psychology uniquely positioned to provide answers as to why it happened and to inoculate itself and others against similar occurrences in the future. Thanks to Dr. Randy Paterson for highlighting the importance of historical knowledge, and to you at home for streaming, downloading, and reviewing today's episode. Mindful is written, hosted, and published by me, Eric Bowman. Our producer is Jamie Montgomery, and our theme music is Avenues by David Taylor.